They laughed when beer was poured over the retired soldier's head. He didn't fight back. He didn't shout. He just stood there, silent, carrying scars no one could see. They thought silence meant weakness. They thought mercy meant fear. That night, they chose the wrong man to humiliate. What they did next crossed a line, hurting the one soul he would die to protect. And when that happened, restraint turned into reckoning. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and the miracles God hides in the darkest places. Winter presses against a small-town bar near Lake Superior, where snow, beer, and old grudges linger under dim yellow lights. Jack Miller did not come to the bar to be noticed. He came because the cold outside felt sharper than usual, because the wind rolling off the lake carried a hollow sound that reminded him of things chasing him in dreams, and because silence, real silence, was harder to find at home than in a room full of strangers. The bar smelled of alcohol, wet coats, and laughter that had long since lost its joy. Jack chose a seat near the wall without thinking, back protected, exits visible, muscle memory guiding him the way it always did. He wrapped his fingers around the cold glass of beer, letting the chill ground him, letting the bitterness cut through the fog in his head. At his feet lay his dog, still as stone but not relaxed, aware of every shift in the room, every raised voice, every chair scraping against the floor. Jack didn't look down, but he felt that presence like a quiet promise. I'm here. He took a slow sip and told himself this was just another night, just another town that didn't know him and didn't need to. That was when he felt it, the weight of eyes. Not curiosity, not passing interest, but the deliberate stare of someone who had already decided what Jack was supposed to be. He didn't look up right away. Predators hated that. A voice cut through the noise, loud and confident, followed by laughter that carried too easily. "You boys see this?" the man said. "Looks like we got ourselves a hero." Jack lifted his eyes then, calm and measured. The man stood loose in his movements, drunk but practiced, the kind of man who filled space because people let him. His gaze locked onto the faded insignia on Jack's jacket. "Seal?" the man said, grinning. "What happened? Wars get boring? Or you finally figured out nobody cares?" The laughter grew. Someone slapped the bar. Jack felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the instinctive readiness that came before thought, before permission. He let it pass like he always did. He smiled, not wide, not mocking, just enough to acknowledge sound without feeding it, and took another sip of beer. That was the mistake. The man's grin faltered, cracked into something sharper. Jack could see the moment it happened. The exact second confusion turned into insult. Being ignored hurt more than being challenged. "Hey," the man said, stepping closer, "I'm talking to you." Jack met his eyes evenly. "I heard you," he said quietly. "I'm just drinking." Something shifted in the bar then, subtle but real. People leaned in. The dog lifted its head slightly, not aggressive, just alert. Jack felt that awareness ripple through him. The dog was reading the room the way Jack once read streets overseas. Angles, intent, threat. Easy, Jack thought. Not yet. The man scoffed, voice louder now. "Figures. All that training, and you're scared of a little conversation?" Jack didn't answer. He drank. Silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable, until it snapped. The beer came out of nowhere, cold and heavy, exploding across Jack's face and collar, dripping onto the floor. For a fraction of a second, time stalled. Then the bar erupted in laughter. Jack closed his eyes, not in anger, but in exhaustion. He could feel old doors inside him creaking open, doors he kept locked with discipline and routine, doors marked react and survive. He forced them shut again, breathing slowly, counting the way he'd been taught. 1, 2, 3. The dog moved before Jack could. A sudden burst of motion, controlled and silent, pure instinct channeled into purpose. The leader went down hard, crashing into a table, glass shattering. The dog stood over him, not attacking, not biting, warning, every muscle coiled, every sense focused. The room went dead quiet. Jack was on his feet instantly. "Down," he said, voice low but absolute. The dog froze, muscles trembling, instinct screaming, but obedience won. It stepped back, eyes never leaving the man on the floor. Jack wiped beer from his eyes with the back of his hand. His heart was steady. His hands didn't shake. That surprised him more than the silence. He looked at the man struggling to his feet, red-faced and humiliated, rage burning just beneath the surface. Jack had seen that look before, in villages, in compounds, in reflections he tried not to remember. "Don't touch my dog," Jack said. "Don't touch me. This ends now." The man glared at him, pride wounded, something darker forming behind his eyes. Jack didn't wait to see what shape it would take. He reached into his pocket, placed cash on the bar without counting, and whistled softly. The dog was at his side in an instant. When Jack pushed open the door, winter hit him like a wall, cold and clean, washing away the smell of beer and sweat. Snow crunched under his boots. Behind him, the bar remained silent, stunned. Jack didn't look back, but he felt the eyes on him, felt the promise forming in that man's mind. As he walked into the snow with his dog beside him, a quiet voice deep inside whispered something he didn't want to hear. "You should have walked away sooner." He kept walking anyway, unaware that the night had already chosen him for something far worse than spilled beer. Late winter afternoon settles over a quiet industrial edge of town where snow clings to rusted roofs, frozen asphalt, and the narrow garage that has become Jack Miller's refuge. The cold felt different here than it had outside the bar, heavier somehow, as if it had weight and intention pressing down on Jack Miller's shoulders while he worked alone in the small garage behind his rented house. The silence he had carried home from the bar still clung to him, stretched thin but unbroken, and he told himself that leaving without striking back had been the right choice. The only choice that allowed the night to end without waking the part of him that never truly slept. He focused on the engine in front of him, hands moving with practiced calm, tightening bolts, wiping grease, listening to the familiar mechanical language that made sense in a way people never quite did. The dog was nearby, present in the way Jack had come to rely on, without admitting how deeply, not resting, not anxious, simply watching the world beyond the open garage door, reading the cold air for threats Jack pretended no longer existed. Jack's thoughts drifted, despite his effort to anchor them, sliding back to the bar, to the man's eyes after the beer had spilled, to the humiliation that had curdled into something sharper, and Jack wondered briefly if walking away had been mistaken for mercy when it had really been restraint. He dismissed the thought and returned to the rhythm of work, because discipline was easier than memory. The sound came suddenly, wrong in its pitch, sharp enough to cut through the steady clink of tools and the hum of his breathing, and Jack froze before he consciously understood what he had heard. The dog's cry carried pain in it, raw and unmistakable, and it struck Jack with a force that bypassed thought entirely. He turned, heart slamming hard against his ribs, and the world narrowed to motion and sound as he ran out of the garage into the snow. The sight met him all at once, fragmented and surreal. The dog collapsed near the fence, the air filled with laughter and engine noise, a pickup truck pulling away too fast, tires spinning, silhouettes inside, moving with careless joy. Jack saw enough to understand without details, saw the violence in the aftermath rather than the act itself, and something inside him tore open with a clarity that frightened him more than the pain did. He dropped to his knees in the snow, hands already moving, voice low and steady, as he pressed against wounds he refused to fully acknowledge, speaking not to calm the dog, but to keep himself from splintering. The dog's trust did not waver, even through pain, and that trust cut Jack deeper than any insult ever had. He lifted the dog carefully, ignoring the cold seeping through his clothes, ignoring the ache blooming in his own joints because there was no room for anything except forward motion now. The drive to the veterinary clinic blurred into a tunnel of headlights and white road, Jack's mind narrowing to the simple, brutal arithmetic of time and blood loss, of keeping pressure steady, of staying awake. The clinic staff moved quickly when he arrived, their voices calm, professional, practiced, and Jack let them take the dog from his arms with reluctance that surprised him in its intensity. He sat alone in the waiting area afterward, hands still stained, staring at nothing, while memories pressed in from every direction, memories of carrying wounded men through dust and smoke, of waiting rooms that smelled like antiseptic, and fear, of promises whispered into chaos that sometimes ended in silence anyway. When the veterinarian finally spoke, the words were measured, careful, and Jack heard the meaning beneath them. Severe injuries, uncertainty, long treatment, no guarantees. He nodded, thanked them, said the right things, because he had learned long ago how to behave when the worst possibility hovered just out of reach. Night fell while Jack remained seated, unmoving, listening to the muted sounds of the clinic, each one a reminder that he was no longer in control. When he was finally allowed to see the dog, he did not stay long, did not touch more than necessary, because he was afraid of what would surface if he let himself linger. He left the clinic with snow falling harder now, the town quieter, as if it sensed the weight he carried back with him. At home, sleep refused him completely. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the truck pulling away, heard the laughter, felt the helplessness twist tighter, and the familiar symptoms crept in uninvited, the shallow breathing, the vigilance that had no off switch, the memories overlapping until past and present blurred into one long, grinding moment. Jack sat at the small kitchen table until dawn, hands wrapped around a mug that went cold untouched, realizing with growing certainty that whatever line he had tried to hold in the bar had been crossed anyway, just not by him. By late afternoon, a strange clarity settled over him, heavy but precise. He returned to the garage not to work, but to clean, to organize, to put every tool back exactly where it belonged, because order was the only thing he could still impose on the world. The dog was not there, and the absence was louder than any sound. Jack understood then that the silence he had chosen the night before had not ended the conflict, only postponed it, and that postponement had cost him something he could not replace. He stood in the cold, breath visible, and felt anger rise not as a flash, but as a slow, deliberate burn, controlled and patient, the kind that did not shout, but waited. Somewhere in town, the men who had laughed believed they had sent a message, believed that pain was enough to establish dominance, and Jack realized, with a clarity sharpened by loss, that they had mistaken restraint for weakness and mercy for fear. He closed the garage door and locked it carefully, knowing that the quiet he sought was gone now, replaced by something inevitable. And as he walked back into the house, a single thought followed him with relentless calm. The next time he saw them, silence would no longer be an option. Night returns to the same bar under falling snow, its windows glowing warmly against the cold, unaware that restraint has ended and consequences are about to arrive. Jack Miller walked back into the bar with the kind of calm that comes only after a decision has already been made, the kind that settles when doubt has burned itself out and left behind something colder and more precise. The bell over the door rang, the same sound as before, but the room felt different to him now, not louder or quieter, just exposed, like a space that had lost the illusion of safety. Conversations slowed as heads turned, recognition rippling outward in uneven waves, and Jack felt the weight of their attention without reacting to it. He did not scan for exits this time, did not choose the wall, did not calculate angles, because tonight he was not here to leave quietly. The absence beside him was a pressure he could feel with every step, the place where his dog should have been echoing with memory, and that absence fueled him more than anger ever could. He moved toward the center of the room, stopped, and let his eyes find the men who had laughed days earlier, the ones who now stiffened as recognition settled into fear, followed quickly by bravado they hoped would hide it. One of them laughed too loudly, too quickly, and said something Jack did not bother to hear. Another reached for a bottle, as if instinctively arming himself. Jack spoke then, his voice even, low, carrying just far enough to cut through the noise. "We're done pretending," he said, not accusing, not pleading, simply stating a fact. The leader rose from his seat, rage flashing across his face, and Jack saw again that familiar pattern, the same one he had seen in men who mistook intimidation for strength. The first punch came fast but sloppy, driven by emotion rather than intent, and Jack stepped inside it without thinking, his body moving on a language older than thought. What followed was not a brawl in the cinematic sense, but a collapse, a rapid unspooling of bravado into pain and confusion. Jack moving through the space with controlled efficiency, redirecting momentum, using the bar's furniture as obstacles rather than weapons, ending threats as quickly as they formed. Bottles shattered, tables overturned, and the bar descended into chaos not because Jack sought destruction, but because violence, once invited, never stays contained. More men rushed him, some hesitating, some reckless, and Jack handled each with the same restraint he had once shown on foreign soil, striking only as much as necessary, never lingering, never escalating beyond control. He felt no satisfaction in it, no rush, only a grim focus sharpened by the image burned into his mind of his dog bleeding in the snow. When one of the men went down hard and did not get back up, a ripple of panic spread through the room, and Jack recognized him dimly as someone younger, someone whose confidence had always been borrowed rather than earned. It was only later he would learn why the police response came as fast and as heavy as it did, sirens tearing through the night, before the echoes of broken glass had fully settled. The officers flooded in with weapons drawn, voices sharp and commanding, and Jack did not resist. He stood where he was, breathing steady, hands visible, allowing himself to be taken in as just another body in the wreckage. The men who had attacked him shouted over one another, accusations spilling out in frantic bursts, but their words lost weight as the officers searched pockets and jackets and began pulling out small bags, pills, substances that shifted the entire narrative in seconds. Jack watched the realization spread across faces, watched bravado curdle into fear, and felt nothing like relief. Only a hollow confirmation that the night had turned exactly as it was meant to. One officer recognized one of the men on the floor and stiffened, murmuring something into a radio, and Jack understood without explanation that power had entered the room, the kind that would complicate everything. As they were herded out, hands cuffed, pride stripped away under fluorescent lights, one of the men twisted his head back toward Jack, smiling despite the blood on his lip, despite the weight of the cuffs. The smile was wrong, too calm, too deliberate. "Careful," he said loudly enough for Jack to hear, for everyone to hear. "Your dog's probably already buried alive." The words landed with surgical precision, bypassing Jack's defenses entirely, and for a moment the room faded, replaced by a flash of snow, earth, and suffocating darkness that clawed at his chest. Jack did not move. He did not speak. He did not give the man the satisfaction of reaction. But something inside him fractured quietly, cleanly, the way ice breaks under pressure, without sound. The officers pushed the man forward, the moment passed, and Jack was left standing amid the ruin, the bar unrecognizable, the warmth gone. Questions followed, procedural and detached, and Jack answered them mechanically, aware only of the growing certainty that whatever had happened to his dog was no longer confined to fear or imagination. He was released hours later into the cold. The case muddied by drugs, by influence, by names that carried weight in places Jack had never cared to belong. He walked home alone, the snow absorbing his footsteps, his thoughts looping relentlessly around the words he had heard, replaying them until they lost shape and became something worse than anger. By the time he reached his house, Jack knew sleep would not come. He sat in the dark, hands clasped, mind racing, not with plans but with memories of times he had been too late, of promises broken by circumstance rather than intent. He understood now that the violence in the bar had not been an end, but an invitation, that he had stepped fully into a conflict that would not be resolved with fists alone. Somewhere, his dog was either suffering or already gone, and the uncertainty gnawed at him with a cruelty that surpassed pain. As dawn crept toward the horizon, Jack rose, already moving toward the next step without knowing what it would be, guided only by the knowledge that silence had been stripped from him entirely, and that the men who thought fear was their weapon had just revealed how little they understood the man they had chosen to provoke. Snow thickens over the city as night tightens its grip, streetlights blurring into pale halos while sirens fade, and a restless wind carries unfinished threats through empty roads. Jack Miller did not wait for morning. The words thrown at him in the bar followed him like a living thing, burrowing deeper with every step he took into the cold, until they were no longer just sound but images, sharp and relentless, that refused to be silenced. He moved with purpose now, not anger, not panic, but a focused urgency born from too many nights when hesitation had cost lives. The motorcycle sat where one of the men had left it, keys still dangling, arrogance disguised as carelessness, and Jack swung onto it without thinking, the engine roaring to life as if eager to be used for something meaningful. The city rushed past him in streaks of white and amber, snow biting at his face, the cold cutting through layers until it reached something deeper, something familiar. He told himself not to imagine, not to let the man's words grow roots in his mind. But imagination did not ask permission, and the silence beside him where his dog should have been screamed louder with every mile. He rode harder, faster, the road narrowing into a single objective, the veterinary clinic glowing ahead like a fragile promise he was afraid to touch. The doors slid open with a hiss that sounded too gentle for the weight pressing on his chest, and Jack barely registered the looks he received as he crossed the floor, his eyes already searching, his body braced for either relief or devastation. The receptionist recognized him immediately, hesitation flashing across her face before concern replaced it, and Jack knew before she spoke that something had shifted in the hours since he last sat in that waiting room. The kennel was empty. The space where his dog had been lay stripped of warmth, sheets pulled back, equipment gone, as if the absence itself had been cleaned and sanitized. Jack stood there longer than he should have, staring at the hollow where life had been, his mind refusing to align with reality. The veterinarian approached carefully, voice low, explaining what Jack already sensed, that someone had come claiming authority, paperwork forged well enough to delay suspicion, confusion layered over routine until it was too late. Jack listened without interruption, every word landing with dull precision, his thoughts fragmenting into patterns he recognized from missions gone wrong, when intel failed and consequences followed. Then he saw the photograph. It lay on the bed where his dog should have been, placed deliberately, cruelly. The image captured his dog injured, confined, surrounded by shapes that could only belong to men who understood power as possession and pain as leverage. Jack picked it up with hands that finally trembled, not from fear but from the effort of holding himself together. The room seemed to tilt, the edges of his vision narrowing as something old and dangerous stirred inside him, something he had spent years burying beneath routine and solitude. He left the clinic without a word, the photograph folded carefully and tucked away, as if protecting it might protect what it represented. Outside, the snow had grown heavier, flakes swirling in chaotic patterns that mirrored the storm building behind his eyes. Days passed without shape or order. Jack did not eat much. He did not sleep at all. Night after night, he sat in the dark of his house, the photograph resting on the table in front of him like an accusation. When he closed his eyes, the past surged forward uninvited, memories of sand and fire and voices lost to static, of bodies carried and promises broken, not by intention but by timing. His breathing grew shallow without warning, his pulse racing as if he were back in places he had sworn never to return to. And he learned again how thin the line was between control and collapse. The PTSD he had managed for years returned with ruthless efficiency, dragging him through nights where every sound became a threat and every shadow held movement. He counted breaths. He grounded himself in physical sensation. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. The photograph haunted him most because it was deliberate. This was not random violence, not drunken cruelty. It was a message composed with care and patience, meant to unbalance him, to pull him into a game where fear was currency. Jack understood that language intimately. He recognized the tactic for what it was, and hated himself for having underestimated the men who had chosen it. Somewhere, his dog was being used not just as bait, but as proof that restraint had consequences, that silence invited escalation. Jack replayed every decision that had led him here, measuring them against outcomes, knowing the exercise was futile, yet unable to stop. He had walked away from the bar to preserve peace, and had brought war home instead. On the fourth night, exhaustion finally claimed him, not as rest, but as collapse. He woke on the floor hours later, disoriented, the taste of blood in his mouth from biting down too hard during dreams he could not remember, but felt etched into his bones. He sat up slowly, back against the wall, and let the clarity come, cold and undeniable. Whatever came next would not be resolved by waiting. The men who had taken his dog wanted a reaction, wanted him destabilized and reckless. Jack would not give them that satisfaction. He rose, showered, dressed with deliberate care, and cleaned his house as if preparing for inspection, every movement a small act of control reclaimed from chaos. By morning, the city looked unchanged, snow-covered, and indifferent. But Jack felt different moving through it, stripped of illusion. He returned to the clinic once more, not to demand answers, but to confirm what he already knew, that official channels would move too slowly, tangled in influence and procedure. The veterinarian met his gaze and said nothing more than necessary, but her eyes carried a sympathy that only deepened Jack's resolve. He left with no new information, only confirmation that the path ahead would be his alone. As he stepped back into the cold, Jack felt the familiar weight settle into his spine, the quiet acceptance that precedes action when all other options have failed. That night, as he sat at his table with the photograph once more, something slid beneath the door, a soft sound against wood that pulled him instantly to his feet. An envelope lay there, plain and unmarked, its presence unmistakably intentional. Jack stared at it for a long moment, pulse steady, mind clear in a way it had not been for days. Whatever waited inside would change the shape of what came next, and as he reached down to pick it up, Jack understood with absolute certainty that the men who thought they controlled the board had just made their final move visible. A violent winter storm swallows the outskirts of the city, snow driven sideways by wind as visibility collapses and the world narrows to cold darkness and the promise of something waiting beyond it. The envelope felt heavier than paper should as Jack Miller turned it over in his hands. The quiet of the house pressing in from all sides, broken only by the low hum of the heater fighting a losing battle against the cold. He did not open it immediately. Experience had taught him that some information, once known, could not be unknown, and that timing mattered as much as content. When he finally slid a finger beneath the flap, His movements were controlled, deliberate, the same care he once used when handling objects that might explode if treated casually. Inside was a single photograph and a short note, nothing more, nothing less. The image struck first, bypassing thought and reason, showing his dog suspended upside down, exhaustion etched into posture and stillness rather than pain alone, the kind of image composed not in haste, but with intent. Jack's breath caught, not in a gasp, but in a tightening that locked his chest, and for a moment the room tilted, the edges of reality threatening to slip away. He forced himself to focus on the note, short and precise, an address scrawled in block letters, a time and a single sentence that carried no emotion at all. Come alone. Jack sat down slowly, the chair creaking beneath his weight, and let the wave pass through him without resistance. Panic wanted his attention, demanded movement, but he denied it the satisfaction. Panic was a luxury he could not afford. He read the note again, memorizing the details, committing them to a part of his mind that remained functional even under extreme pressure. The address was remote, far from the city lights, somewhere the storm would hit hardest, and Jack understood the message clearly enough. The journey itself was part of the test. He folded the photograph carefully, placed it back inside the envelope, and closed his eyes, counting breaths until the shaking in his hands subsided. The men behind this were not improvising. They were confident, patient, and they believed they controlled the tempo now. Jack knew better than to assume control was permanent. Preparation followed instinctively. He dressed for the storm, layers chosen for function rather than comfort, checking equipment not with urgency, but with ritual precision, grounding himself in familiar motions. Each item had its place, each movement a way to quiet the noise in his head. He left the house without hesitation, locking the door behind him as if there were anything left inside worth protecting. Outside, the wind cut into him immediately, snow stinging exposed skin, visibility reduced to shifting white shapes that erased distance and direction. He moved forward anyway, guided by memory, by compass, by the stubborn refusal to stop that had carried him through worse conditions in other places, other lives. As the hours passed, the storm intensified, turning progress into struggle. Jack's muscles burned, his breath ragged as the cold worked its way deeper, draining strength faster than he calculated. He adjusted his pace, corrected course repeatedly, but the landscape became unfamiliar, landmarks swallowed by snow, sound distorted by wind, until even his own movements felt detached. Fatigue crept in gradually, insidious rather than dramatic, dulling the edges of his focus, and with it came memories he had no energy left to keep at bay. He saw faces from years ago, heard voices calling his name through static and gunfire, felt the same creeping certainty that no matter how hard he pushed, he might still arrive too late. The image from the envelope returned unbidden, sharper now, and Jack clenched his jaw, forcing his legs to move, even as they protested. The moment he realized he was in trouble arrived quietly. His steps slowed despite his will, coordination slipping just enough to be noticeable, and he recognized the warning signs with a clarity born of experience. Hypothermia was not dramatic. It was deceptive, persuasive, whispering rest where there was none. Jack tried to push through it, tried to focus on the address, the time, the promise of reunion that anchored him, but the storm had stripped the world down to cold and effort was becoming harder to summon. He stumbled once, caught himself, then stumbled again, the ground rising to meet him with a final, unyielding certainty. The sky above blurred into a uniform gray, snowflakes melting against his lashes, and for a moment he lay still, not defeated, but suspended between action and surrender. As consciousness slipped, Jack's thoughts fractured into fragments rather than sentences. He thought of the dog not as an image of suffering, but as presence, loyalty without condition, a steady force that had anchored him when everything else felt unmoored. He thought of the line he had crossed when he chose to go back to the bar, of the price already paid, and of the one still waiting. Somewhere beyond the storm, people believed they were orchestrating his collapse, that they had reduced him to reaction and desperation. The irony, fading as darkness crept in, was that Jack had survived worse moments by letting go, rather than fighting blindly, by trusting that consciousness could return, even when control did not. The wind roared around him, indifferent, and the last thing he felt before everything went dark was the cold seeping inward, steady and relentless, as the storm claimed him and carried him into silence. A remote mountain cabin stands buried in snow as dawn breaks weakly through storm clouds, smoke rising from a chimney, while the wind eases just enough to reveal survival where collapse should have ended everything. Consciousness returned to Jack Miller in fragments rather than clarity, sensation arriving before understanding, warmth pressing against skin that had grown too accustomed to cold, the steady crackle of fire replacing the roar of the storm that had swallowed him whole. His body protested the attempt to move, pain flaring in joints and muscles, as if reminding him how close he had come to not waking at all. And for several seconds he simply lay still, listening, breathing, confirming that the rhythm in his chest was real and not imagined. Something brushed against his hand, deliberate and gentle, and instinct surged before reason, Jack's muscles tensing, ready to react, until his eyes focused, and he saw the outline of a dog standing beside the bed. Relief surged through him so sharply it almost hurt, a desperate hope igniting before it could be restrained. But it faded just as quickly when he understood that this was not his dog, that the presence he felt, familiar yet different, belonged to another life, another bond. The disappointment settled heavy and quiet, a reminder that nothing had been resolved simply because he had survived. A woman entered the room then, movements careful, practiced, carrying herself with the awareness of someone who had learned to live without drawing attention. She spoke calmly, explained where he was, how she had found him half buried in snow not far from the cabin, how the storm would have finished what exhaustion had started if she had arrived any later. Jack listened without interruption, absorbing the information the way he always did, filtering emotion from fact, even as his mind struggled to catch up with his body. When she introduced herself only by a first name and said no more than necessary, Jack understood without being told that this was intentional, that names were weight and weight was dangerous. She did not ask who he was or why he had been pushing through a blizzard alone, and that restraint told him more than curiosity ever could. As strength slowly returned, Jack learned what she was willing to share. She was living here under an assumed quiet, embedded in a place most people passed without noticing, waiting for threads to connect, for a network to reveal itself. A long-term operation, she explained, aimed at dismantling a regional drug pipeline that used isolation and corruption as shields, and despite months of watching, listening, and documenting, the final link remained elusive. Jack heard the familiar frustration beneath her controlled tone, the kind that came from knowing you were close without being able to prove it. When he mentioned the letter, the photograph, the coordinates, something in her expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable, and she admitted that the address and timing matched fragments she had been circling for weeks without confirmation. What Jack had taken as a personal threat, she recognized as a signal flare, a careless but confident move from people who believed themselves untouchable. The other dog watched them quietly as they spoke, alert without intrusion, its presence a constant reminder to Jack of what he had lost and what he still hoped to reclaim. He felt the pull of urgency tightening again, the instinct to leave immediately, to finish what he had started, but his body refused the command, weakness dragging him back into the present. The woman saw it, not with sympathy, but with assessment, and told him plainly that charging ahead alone would only end one way, that the storm had already proven how thin the margin was between determination and death. Jack did not argue. He had learned long ago that survival sometimes required listening as much as action. As the hours passed, strength returned in increments, enough for Jack to sit up fully, to drink, to move without dizziness threatening to undo him. The woman laid out what she knew, sparse but meaningful, a map of partial truths that aligned too cleanly with Jack's experience to ignore. The men who had targeted him were not operating in isolation. They were connected to something larger, protected by influence and intimidation, and his dog had become leverage precisely because it mattered. Jack felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle in his chest, heavier now because it extended beyond himself, beyond personal loss, into territory that demanded consequence rather than revenge. He realized then that the letter had not just been bait, but a mistake, an overconfident gesture that had drawn two separate lines of pursuit together at exactly the wrong moment for the people who sent it. By nightfall, the storm had passed, leaving the world eerily still beneath fresh snow. Jack stood at the window, looking out over the white expanse, feeling the ache in his body as proof that he was still alive, still capable of choosing what came next. The woman joined him, not close, not distant, and told him that the coordinates from the letter were the strongest lead she had seen, that moving on them together could finally expose what had remained hidden. Jack nodded slowly, the decision forming without drama, without doubt. He had crossed too many lines already to turn back now, and for the first time since the garage, since the sound of his dog's pain, the chaos inside him began to organize into something usable. As he lay back down to rest, conserving strength for what would come, Jack understood that waking in this cabin had not been chance or rescue alone. It was alignment. The storm had not ended his pursuit, it had redirected it. Somewhere beyond the mountains, people believed they still controlled the game, believed fear and cruelty were enough to keep power intact. Jack closed his eyes, breathing evenly, knowing that when morning came, he would not be walking back into darkness alone, and that the next move would lead him closer to answers he had not been prepared to seek, but could no longer avoid. Snow drifts around an abandoned compound beyond the mountains as night closes in, floodlights cutting weak paths through white silence, while the storm's aftermath leaves the land exposed and nowhere left to hide. Jack Miller moved with measured certainty through the frozen perimeter alongside the woman who had pulled him back from the edge, her presence steady and purposeful, and the dog that followed her reading the dark with instincts sharpened by training and experience, every sense tuned toward threat rather than fear. The coordinates from the letter had led them here, to a cluster of structures half buried in snow and arrogance, a place that relied on isolation more than secrecy, and Jack understood immediately why it had survived so long unnoticed. This was a place built on the assumption that no one would come looking, and that assumption had finally failed. They advanced without haste, not as hunters drunk on pursuit, but as people who knew exactly what waited ahead, the woman signaling when to stop, when to move, her knowledge of the operation filling in gaps Jack had only felt rather than named. The dog moved first when it mattered, not attacking blindly, but redirecting, blocking, creating space where space was needed, its loyalty expressed not in noise, but in action. And Jack felt the old rhythm return, the one he had tried to bury with solitude, the rhythm of coordinated movement and trust forged under pressure. Inside the compound, resistance came fast and clumsy, men scrambling to defend something they had never believed could be threatened. And Jack handled them with the same restraint that had defined his choices from the beginning, ending fights efficiently, without cruelty, because cruelty was the language of people who had already lost control. The leader revealed himself only when retreat failed, stepping into the open with a gun in hand and rage poorly disguised as authority, and Jack recognized him instantly, not by face, but by intent, by the certainty that this man's world had been built on intimidation, reinforced by connections that kept consequences distant. The man spoke Jack's name with the confidence of someone who believed knowledge equaled power, and made it clear enough why, mentioning his son without remorse or reflection, framing vengeance as inevitability rather than choice. Jack listened, calm and focused, hearing not a father's grief, but a challenge born from entitlement, and when the man raised the weapon, Jack did not hesitate. The confrontation ended quickly, not with triumph, but with inevitability. The leader disarmed and restrained as law enforcement vehicles tore through the silence, lights flaring across snow that moments earlier had hidden everything. The woman stepped back as agents moved in, identifying themselves with efficiency that made it clear this operation had been waiting for a final door to open. And Jack understood then that the letter had not just drawn him into danger, but had accelerated an outcome that was already approaching. The compound fell under control in minutes, men taken into custody, evidence exposed, and the network that had seemed untouchable reduced to procedure and documentation. Through it all, Jack's focus remained fixed on a single point until it was finally resolved. The door to a back structure opening to reveal what had been used as leverage, his dog alive, exhausted but unbroken, the connection between them immediate and absolute in a way that required no words. Jack knelt, steadying himself as much as the animal, feeling the weight lift not as relief alone, but as something closer to closure. And in that moment, he understood how close he had come to losing not just a companion, but the last tether holding him to restraint. The woman watched from a distance, satisfied not with victory, but with completion. And she told Jack quietly that the case would stand, that influence would not erase what had been uncovered, that for once the system would do what it claimed to do. Jack nodded, accepting the statement without celebration, because he had learned that justice was not an emotion, but a process that rarely felt as clean as people wanted it to. As dawn crept across the snow-covered ground, Jack stood beside his dog while agents finished their work, the cold no longer biting in the same way, the noise of the world returning gradually and without threat. The woman approached once more, offered a brief acknowledgement rather than gratitude, understanding that shared purpose did not require ceremony, and she left with her dog shortly after, returning to a life that demanded invisibility rather than recognition. Jack watched them go, aware that paths could intersect without merging, and that some alliances existed only for as long as they were needed. When the last vehicle disappeared and silence settled again, Jack turned away from the compound and began the walk back through the snow, his dog moving beside him with familiar assurance. The town would wake later to rumors and headlines, to fragments of a story that would never quite capture what had happened or why, and Jack would return to a life that looked unchanged from the outside. He knew the nights would still be quiet and sometimes difficult, that memories would not vanish simply because this chapter had closed, but something fundamental had shifted, a balance restored not by violence but by choosing when to stop and when to act. As he reached the edge of the trees and the first light of morning filtered through, Jack felt neither victory nor defeat, only a calm acceptance that the storm he had walked into had finally passed, leaving behind a world that was imperfect but intact, and a bond that had survived cruelty, distance, and silence. He did not look back at the compound or the path that had led him there, because for the first time in a long while there was nothing chasing him, and the quiet ahead felt earned rather than fragile. Sometimes the miracle does not arrive as thunder or fire from the sky. Sometimes it comes quietly, disguised as endurance, timing, or the strength to keep walking, when everything inside says stop. Jack Miller believed he was fighting alone, guided only by instinct and discipline, but the truth is simpler and deeper. There were moments he should not have survived, roads he should not have found, doors that should not have opened. And yet they did. Faith does not always mean hearing God's voice clearly. Often It means being carried when we are too exhausted to stand, protected when we cannot see the danger, and redirected when our path would have led to destruction. What looked like coincidence was grace. What felt like stubborn survival was mercy, and what seemed like loss became the reason salvation arrived in time. In everyday life, many people watching this story are fighting storms of their own. Some are quiet battles no one sees. Some are losses that feel unfair. Some are nights when silence hurts more than noise. This story is a reminder that you are not forgotten. That strength does not come only from muscles or willpower, but from a hand unseen that steadies you when you fall. If this story touched something inside you, share it with someone who might be walking through their own winter. Leave a comment with your thoughts or your prayer, and let others know they are not alone. Subscribe to the channel so these stories can continue reaching hearts that need hope. And finally, may God watch over every person listening right now. May He protect your loved ones, give you peace in your storms, and guide you when the road disappears under snow. Sometimes the greatest miracle is simply waking up and finding the strength to keep going. And that strength is never yours alone.